Hello and welcome to SCM Now Impact Live series. My name is Matt Talbert. I am the research manager at ASCM, filling in for Beth Rennie. I am with our CEO, Abe Eshkenazi. Hi, Abe.
Hey, Matt, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks for joining us. If you are watching this but did not receive an email from Abe on Friday, I'd like to quickly point out you could subscribe at acm.org/impact for free. Abe, more than ever, we have learned the importance of resilience when it comes to a global crisis and for the ensuing recession. Could you talk to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I think this is sort of one of the hallmarks of supply chain professionals, the ability to plan accordingly for not only normal productions, but for disruptions. And I think what we're seeing here is a significant challenge for a lot of supply chain professionals. Obviously, we work with data. And the more data that we have, the better that our forecasts are and the better our ability to identify what we need to, prepare for as an organization and as a supply chain. Using data, organizations and supply chain professionals do scenario planning. They plan for a variety of different outcomes. Using prior disruptions often as a guide, both the challenges as well as the benefits of responding to disruptions. Unfortunately, in this particular case, we've encountered a global pandemic that has affected every aspect of supply chain, from the demand to the supply to the consumer and to the patient alike. And so we're seeing that the data points that supply chain professionals have to rely on are bouncing all over the board. And so it makes it very difficult for supply chain professionals to plan accordingly based on the current disruption. And so as organizations and individuals start to absorb and start to understand the true impact of the disruption on their supply chains, we'll prepare for different disruptions. We'll most likely not see another, hopefully, a disruption at this extent or this severity in the future. But there are going to be other disruptions. And using scenario planning, supply chain professionals can take the necessary steps to oftentimes prevent or mitigate or reduce the effect of the disruption. More importantly, how to survive during the disruption. And then finally, what do you need to do after the disruption occurs? How do you get yourself back right-sized? How do you become a much more agile, responsive organization? So this particular pandemic, as well as the economic crisis, has really created a new playing field for a lot of supply chain professionals and organizations, not only prior to the disruptions, but during and most importantly after the disruption.
So two key things that you mentioned was data and agility. So recently our Research, Innovation, and Sensing Committee formed a panel, a corporate research panel among our corporate members, and we recently surveyed them and collected some data on their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And there are some lessons to be learned from this. Now, the results that we saw coming in early from the study that they headed up was the importance of agility. I know you touched on that a little bit, but could you go into more detail about some strategies that will make supply chains more agile?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I think we've seen organizations that have responded fairly well to this. So there are a couple of indicators, and I know that hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit about Morgan Swink's research, because I think that provided us quite a bit more information. But the focus on agility, it's kind of interesting when we take a look at the supply chain industry as a whole. And obviously, every industry has its own unique challenges and opportunities. But when we take a look at the supply chain industry as a whole, it was extremely strong. I mean, we were responding to consumer demands almost overnight or same-day delivery. Oftentimes, we're seeing e-commerce having a significant growth opportunity for a lot of organizations, and companies were responding. So this was a fairly well-orchestrated supply chain industry prior to the pandemic. Obviously, what we've seen is that as lean and effective and as efficient we were, those are the very criteria that made us maybe not as responsive to the challenges when we saw spikes in surge demand, whether it be for plastic or paper goods or into the personal protection equipment. We saw a significant surge and our inability to respond to those surges in demand. Additionally, when we saw demand shift from either an office environment, a conference, into a home-based environment where individuals are consuming more of their food, we've seen organizations struggle to respond to those types of shifts as well. So our hope, and we'll definitely see this with organizations as they come out of the recession, a much greater focus on agility and responsiveness to the risk and resiliency issue. This has become a much greater imperative for organizations to not only identify the risk and play a number of scenarios and what if exercises, but more importantly, how do you become resilient as an organization? What are those criteria? What are those key indicators for an organization that will make you not only maybe avoid a disruption, but more importantly, respond quicker and more resilient as an organization to any disruption that occurs? There are some key indicators that we found, but more importantly, we think as organizations come out of this disruption, much greater attention to agility and responsiveness and transparency in their supply chain, which will allow them to respond much greater in much more rapid fashion than we've seen in the past. Obviously, this disruption has caught a lot of organizations by surprise, but we learn, and that's going back to the concept of the data. The greater information that we have and the more accuracy on the data, the greater our ability to forecast and respond to the challenges.
So you mentioned Morgan Swink, professor of Texas Christian University. So we partnered with him recently on key strategies for overcoming a recession, and agility and resilience comes into play there as well. But overall, his study showed that supply chain excellent firms outperform their industry peers.
No, I think this is one of the great takeaways that we had from the recession in 2008, 2009, are what are those indicators that organizations need to pay attention to make them much more responsive to a disruption. And first, it varies by industry, and not a surprise given the complexity of supply chains, whether it be for food or aerospace or automotive or electronics. Every supply chain has its unique aspects, whether on production and or sourcing or manufacturing. So we have to, evaluate it by industries. More importantly, some of the industries are just entering their recession while others are exiting the recession already. So each of the impacts on supply chains is dependent on the industry that you're in, and not everybody's experiencing the same effect of the disruption. More importantly, what we've learned from Morgan's research is some of the findings were consistent with our expectations on what you would see on organizations that are more responsive. First, higher working capital, much more flexibility to invest and transform digital investments and or take advantage of opportunities to invest in different markets or different consumer segments. Inventories tended to be fairly low, as well as with their accounts receivable, so that they were managing fairly tight to their deliveries with their inventory being lowered, and their collection obviously being much more effective in terms of getting cash into the door. Not surprisingly, SG&A expenses were lower for those organizations that did respond better. Also, postponement in manufacturing, the ability to delay the investment in your final product before it gets to market. Those are what we would expect to see from organizations that were more responsive. There were some interesting findings that we didn't expect, and that is that variable cost structures responded better, that means higher labor, versus capital-intensive organizations. And so almost counterintuitive, you would have expected that capital intensive would have responded much better. Not so. What we found is that those that had variable cost structures with the flexibility on their workforce responded much better than those organizations that were capital intensive. Secondly, and quite interestingly, we found that organizations that paid their suppliers faster were much better prepared as an organization, and their visibility and transparency across their network enabled them to see their vendors as partners, as opposed to a tier one supplier, and that we try to squeeze the last dollar out of our procurement from you. So using, the vendors and their organizations and their vendors, vendor, tier one, tier two, tier three, as partners in their organization, as opposed to an outside entity, help them respond. So let's talk about the results. What happened when those organizations were better prepared? Highly ranked firms outperformed their counterparts by 4% on return on equity. Those are substantial numbers. Even a 1% change in return on equity is a substantial number. When you see a 4% higher on ROE for those top tier organizations, obviously they're paying attention to the key metrics. Secondly, and with a shout out to our ASCM corporate members, those firms had a 4% above the sales decline of other organizations. That means their sales did not decline as fast as other organizations. Obviously, attention to your workforce, attention to your customers, and to your partners are key aspects of being a resilient and responsive organization. On the backside, we'll see much more focus on agility, risk, and resiliency, as we discussed before. Those were hallmarks of organizations that did respond better.
So yeah, you touched on a lot of points relating to resiliency and how supply chain excellence leads to much greater supply chain resiliency in terms of how you could respond to a recession, how you have a much greater risk management strategy. I do want to touch on the backside. So my last question that I would like to leave with you and the audience would be taking advantage of a recession. It kind of sounds counterintuitive that you would take advantage of something that's, in a sense, negative. Yeah. But it's an opportunity to garner market share. So assuming that supply chain excellent organizations have recently survived the recession, what could they do to gain a competitive advantage in such an economic environment?
Yeah, that's I think a lot of organizations are trying to evaluate, what the new normal or what their opportunities look like in the future. Morgan does give us a little bit of insight into this as well through his research. But also, let me first hit on Morgan's information. He identified 3 key areas. First, focus. Second is transformation. And third is growth. On the focus areas, obviously, you need to control your working capital and reduce as much complexity in your organization as possible. Working capital and capital expenditures obviously need to be closely monitored. These are the nuts and bolts of any response on the financial side. To your point on transformation, this is an opportunity to transform an organization. If your investment in digital was significant before, it needs to even be greater today in terms of responding and being much more flexible as an organization with their digital transformation for the organization. Ability to capitalize on your organization's strength and, more importantly, on your workforce. This is the time to invest in your talent. This is not the time to pull back. If organizations are consistent in terms of their walk, and that's backing up their comments, in employees being their number one asset, then invest in your number one asset like it is your most critical asset for the organization. And then lastly, target opportunities for change and or market share or acquisitions. If you have developed a responsive organization, this is the time that you can gain market share from your competitors by being much more responsive to the customer's expectations or the patient's expectations. And then finally, transparency and visibility in your supply chain. Build and solidify your supplier and partner network relationships. As we've seen before, those organizations that embrace their partners and their vendors within their ecosystem and ensure their sustainability are much more likely to have a successful outcome on the backside. This is obviously a transformation in every aspect, from workforce to investment to production to raw materials. Our hope is that when we do come out of this, we do so in a sustainable manner. And that is, the decisions that we're making today do have a focus on the economic side, but as well as on the environmental and the ethical challenges that we face in our supply chains that existed before the disruption. So as we come out of this and we start to focus on the economics and supply chain helping our economy recover, let's make sure we do so in a sustainable and responsible fashion.
That is great, Abe. Those are all great points that we could learn from being more agile and from moving forward through this recession, and how we could have much greater supply chains on the back end. But Abe, I want to thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who's watching. Remember to follow ASCM on our LinkedIn and YouTube channels to never forget an episode. So long, everyone, and thanks, Abe.
Thanks, Matt. Stay safe and healthy.
Thanks, you as well.